Hello, this is Miss Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics that you would see in a comedy by William Shakespeare. Now, I know we're used to thinking of a comedy as something that makes us laugh. If your friend said, "Hey, do you want to go to the movies? Do you want to see a comedy? Do you want to see an action flick?" You'd expect to see something if you went to a comedy that had a lot of funny stuff in it. But the classical definition of a comedy doesn't necessarily mean something that you laugh at every 5 minutes. And a comedy is when the protagonist wins. Basically, the protagonist is able to overcome the obstacles and they do achieve their objective. This usually results in some kind of a happy ending, as opposed to the tragedy where the hero is unable to overcome the obstacles. Now, in Shakespeare's comedies, we often find that courtship and love are the central theme. Sometimes they follow that classic pattern of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back again. But usually there's some sort of a courtship and something's in the way. There's some sort of obstacles happening to true love. And the classic ending to a Shakespearean comedy will be a wedding, or sometimes even multiple weddings. At the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, we have three weddings happening and an already married couple reuniting at the end. Many of Shakespeare's comedies involve these kind of unrealistic elements, almost a fantasy sort of bit. We often have settings that are sort of fairy tale-ish, events that happen that seem kind of hard to believe. Shakespeare's aim in the comedy is to take the audience out of the real life and move into a more, imaginative sort of region. It's kind of an escapism sort of idea. If you think about your typical Elizabethan lifestyle, these are people who are working really hard and dealing with an awful lot of things, not unlike the things that we have to deal with as well. But they didn't want to come to the play to see something ordinary. They didn't want to see, wow, that's exactly the way my life is. They want to be taken out of their lives. They want something extraordinary and exotic. So Shakespeare often chooses stories that do for some reason fixate around this idea of some fantastic hypothesis, something that really that's the way you think things would happen, some event or a lot of coincidences that are set up in order to have this kind of an escape idea. I want you to think about some times that you think you've been having a really bad day. And then Shakespeare's characters in comedies are often thrown into the worst day of their life. They're often in a really strange or absurd situation, and they're very often trying to pursue their love interest in the middle of the situation. They might be lost on the woods, they might be shipwrecked, they might be out of town for some reason. But there's all of these interesting devices that Shakespeare uses to take the characters out of their ordinary existence, throw them into this crazy situation, and then have them try to win true love. Often in the comedy, you'll see what's referred to as the green world pattern. That is, the play begins in the city or the court, then all of the characters, through some device or another, have an excuse. They're moved out to the country, and that's where a lot of the conflicts and things happen. And then there's some excuse that they end up back in the city again. And being out in the country is better because the woods sort of represent, again, this freedom from city life and expectations. Things are kind of uncivilized, but back in the court, they have to be very proper and follow the customs and the laws and behave rationally. But in the woods, in the moonlight, you can kind of lose your mind and go crazy. That's what love tends to do to people anyway. But when you're back in the city, you have to be all proper. You'll see this pattern where they start in one place in like the civilized town, move out to the forest or the countryside in some way, and then come back into their regular lives. Now, Shakespeare's comedies are often described as love stories, and that's actually pretty true for most of them. But he very often will show different aspects of love. You certainly have the classic sort of courtship, and we get a lot of this idea of true love or love at first sight. But sometimes there's kind of a witty love where you have the marriage of the minds and people are challenge each other in their intellectual pursuits. Sometimes there's this kind of earthy, sexy kind of love with body overtones that sort of the lower class characters or villains are making all kinds of dirty jokes and that sort of thing. And a lot of times the comedy comes from mistaken love. That is, there's inappropriate attraction, love triangles, mistaken identities, all of those things that is like, oops, you think you're in love with someone, but you really shouldn't be, or you're really in love with the wrong person. Shakespeare's comedies rely on a lot of devices that often help to set up these absurd situations. There's an awful lot of sets of twins, which means there's often mistaken identities, brothers and sisters, or other kinds of lookalikes. There's a lot of characters in disguises. Sometimes they're gender disguises. We have girls disguising as guys, guys disguising as women, the kind of cross-dressing sort of comedy. Sometimes there's magic, enchantments, love potions of some kind, the idea of people being love struck. And often there's multiple plot lines. You're watching all these different kind of love stories. You may be watching a king and a queen. You may be watching some middle folks in the court, and you may be watching some lower peasants, all having various love triangles and issues, often within this very same play. As a matter of fact, a lot of the comedy is dependent on this dramatic irony, that idea that the audience knows the truth, but the characters in the play don't. So the audience is in on the joke, but the characters don't. And that's where you get all of these opportunities for double meanings and subtlety and disguises. Many of the comedies use what we call sort of stock characters. These are the common sorts of character types that you'll find in a lot of the plays. The leads are usually some kind of high social class, if not outright royal. The women tend to be not only beautiful, but they're also very witty and intelligent. There's often sidekicks, kind of wingmen, or the best friend that goes out with everyone. There's often blocking, that is, the characters are the ones who are going to put the obstacles in the lover's path. Usually in a Shakespearean comedy, you'll find at least one or two of these kinds of tricksters and clowns, that kind of comic relief, lower social order. And often the heroine storyline is the dominant one. We often watch the women trying to find their true love and go through all these trials and things, rather than having the males be the leads, which is more typical in the tragedies. You may notice also that Shakespeare's language is a little bit different in the comedies than it is in the tragedies. Now, we'll still see iambic pentameter and a lot of use of verse, but you'll also notice things like wit. There's a lot of puns and quips. There's wordplay. You may see music in the play. Sometimes there's full songs that the character sings, and very often, again, the literal music with it that's played as part of the actual play. Oftentimes, the plot involves what we would call a comedy of manners. That is, the comedy comes from the fact that we know how characters are supposed to behave based on their social class, and then they don't for some reason. So sometimes there's switches in the social order, in gender, court customs, country mannerisms, and then you get a lot of this humor comes from mocking and mirroring what we would think of as the social norms and the rank and status of the characters. Usually the comedies will have some character who acts as the fool. And this is some sort of a trickster or a clown. Often the person is sort of setting up or manipulating the situations for the protagonist. Sometimes they're playing practical jokes, kind of going around punking all of the key characters. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're used to thinking of comedy meaning funny, but some of Shakespeare's comedies are actually quite dark. They deal with themes of death and sickness and punishment or loss, but for the protagonists, the really worst consequences of these items are usually avoided, escaped, thwarted, or fought back against in some way. So again, you still could have some pretty dark issues that take place within a Shakespearean comedy, but the hero or the protagonist is going to be successful and pushing back against these darker elements. One of Shakespeare's favorite devices is the play within a play. We certainly saw this in Hamlet, which is a tragedy, but in every single one of Shakespeare's comedies, except the very first one he wrote, there's some sort of an internal theater motif. It may be a frame play, so you start off with the characters are telling a story and then they all sit back to watch the show unfold. There's this play within a play. There's characters who work in the theater. The characters may be setting up these elaborate pranks or show for characters who don't know this. And again, this idea of disguises, masks, and masquerades. Shakespeare really loved to play with this idea of the theatricality of what was happening. When we began our unit on Shakespeare, we talked about the four things that really make Shakespeare so great. And those still continue into the comedies, you'll see this. You'll see these fully developed characters. You'll see this kind of gift for the insight into strengths and even the weaknesses of human nature. We see that man is comical because people are by nature victims of their own illusions, what they think about the world. Most of the comedies don't laugh at individual people because they're weak or affected in some way, but rather Shakespeare's comedies are really poking fun at all of mankind because our very essence is a bundle of contradictions. So we see that these comedies do have their funny bits and a happy ending, but they're also emotional and fanciful and tender and above all very, very human.